So due to popular demand, we're going to have a look at a really amazing engine from Nissan, the RB25. It's been used in loads of tuning projects. It really is a staple of the aftermarket tuning world. And we've seen some really impressive power gains on the RB25. So we're going to look at this amazing engine and just discuss some of the best mods and upgrades that we found for it. Now, TMF Motorsport have actually helped us out with an article on our website. So kudos and thanks to them for their support in this. And please let us know in your feedback what comments you have on the RB25, which mods you feel are the best, whether you agree with the statements that we've made in this video and in the article, because getting all this feedback together really helps us to have a much more rounded out view of the world of tuning these amazing engines. And it's important to note there are some differences between the RB25 engines. Even from the factory, there were various different power levels offered. So if you've got a Skyline or a car with the Tiptronic gearbox, the approach to tuning is completely different because that Tiptronic gearbox is not great at handling massive power gains. So you need a slightly different approach to tuning your RB25 engine just to get the best results out of your setup. Tiptronic is typically an Skyline R34 only thing. The R33 had the normal 4-speed auto box with settings for snow, power and economy modes. And that was certainly a stronger gearbox and able to tolerate a lot more. So just be careful if you've got one of the R34s with the Tiptronic gearbox. You certainly wouldn't want to compromise your tuning project with a weak area in the gearbox. So the RB25 is a 2.5 litre 24 valve engine with 6 cylinders. There was a non-turbo version. The RB25DE didn't have a turbo fitted, and power output on that was much down on what we see from the turbo models at around about 180 to 200 horsepower. The RB25 DET did have a turbo on it, and power figures on that was much more respectable compared to its non-turbo brother, and that hovered around about the 250 horsepower mark. There were Neo variants that came out of both of those engines, which basically upped the power levels a little bit more. The non-turbo RB25DE saw power approaching 219 horsepower, whereas the turbo version, the RB25 DET, saw power go up to 276 horsepower. There are 3 basic spec versions, the Spec 1, Spec 2 and Spec 3. So we just have a quick look at what those different specs were. So Spec 1, it had an ignition amplifier. The coil packs are marked with an I and an E. The coil pack loom is different on those, and that required adjustments in the overall engine loom. And these were typically found in the 93, 94 versions of the engine, but there are some exceptions to that. It's not a hard and fast rule we found. The S1 also had an aluminium compressor wheel, but later models they went over to a ceramic construction. On the Spec 2 engines, it lost that ignition amplifier. The coil packs are marked IBG plus typically, and the coil pack looks different. Again, the wiring loom is going to be different on those models to accommodate that. The camshaft angle sensor, the CAS, was also revised for a Mitsubishi unit. Now, the early ones suffered from broken positioning teeth, which obviously caused problems. There was a later black revision of the CAS that came out that addressed that weak area. The Spec 3 engine was typically found on very late R33 models from about 1997 onwards, so we're talking late 1997 there. They run very different camshafts. The crank angle sensor was the one that went on to be used in the RB25 DET engine version. So I'd really encourage you, before you start tuning your RB25 and just getting a parts catalogue and buying random parts, is to have a power target that you're aiming for. Most projects fail because a lot of people choose this pick and mix bolt-on approach where parts are bought at random and added, and hopefully an improvement is. It's a bit of backtracking and having to undo parts that aren't as effective with the new parts that you've added. So have a plan quite clearly, particularly have a goal in power, because that power goal will determine to a large extent what mods you need to do to achieve that power goal. So some good power targets around about 300 horsepower, 350 horsepower and 450 horsepower. So they're relatively close together, but there's quite a different approach in each of those steps. And if you're going for race spec, you may well be wanting to go far beyond the 400 450 horsepower. So we will discuss mods and upgrades for that. But just by putting your car in one of those categories, it'll have a big bearing on which parts you want and which ones will make your project on your RB25 a success. When you go over 500 brake horsepower, you really are getting into the realms of needing to do lots of extra strengthening work on the engine to make sure it can tolerate that. Now, I know some project cars have got away with high power figures on stock internals, but I wouldn't mind betting that that is not going to last for a substantial period of time, or if it's used heavily in motorsport environments, it's going to start breaking. So we really want you to keep your reliability on the engine. So if you're going beyond the 500 horsepower, think about strengthening the bottom end of the engine and really sorting out the mapping and the fueling, because they are going to be vital to the success of your project. So fast road cams are often dropped into these engines because they provide a more optimal profile for the intake and the exhaust valves. So obviously you wouldn't want to go too aggressive with the camshaft. The camshaft is a relatively complex mod. You can bolt it in, but it does require some setting up and some knowledge of the RB25 engine just to get the maximum power from it. So camshafts are probably a more exotic option that people would go for on the RB25. Please let me know what your experiences have been with the RB25 engine. Do you feel that just optimizing the other settings in the engine will do away with the need for this performance camshaft upgrade? And I'll be interested to know particularly what durations you found were the most optimal on your RB25, and let us know what power levels you're actually running, because that certainly has a bearing on it. There were a few hydraulic lifters and solid lifters available on the RB25 version, but in the main the RB26 comes with lifters that enable it to rev to much higher levels, and swapping out the lifters on the RB25 was a real pain. So the best mods, we'll just summarize them and then we'll go into detail. So a boost controller, that's quite essential. It's just making sure that you've got more control over the amount of boost that turbocharger is supplying. Remapping, so in most cases you really need to go for an aftermarket ECU. The more complex your project is, the more complex engine management unit you need, and the stock one is not particularly flexible, so we would certainly recommend that you consider going the aftermarket route, and there's a few different options that we're going to look at that will help you to get the right mapping and the right computer in your RB25 project, just to avoid disappointment further down the line. Turbo upgrades are significant power hikes, so choosing a turbo optimized to the power range that you actually want can really have a major bearing on the power you make, and in some cases it can even double your engine's power relatively easily just from that one bolt-on mod. But obviously you would need to do other supporting mods, particularly around the fueling, to support that. So we'll be discussing turbo mods in a bit more detail. Intercooler upgrades are certainly worth thinking about. They won't necessarily increase the power, but they'll enable you to keep your boost on for longer. So we're going to talk about heat soak later in that section on intercoolers and how to optimize the intercooler on your RB25 project just to avoid that power soak problem that you might get. Changing the induction kit, the headers on the exhaust, they're all popular mods, and they certainly will have a bearing on power, but we'd certainly be looking at that in a bit more detail because it's not the mod that you would want to do to a stock engine necessarily. The basic setup isn't too bad on the RB25 in most of the applications that we've seen. So dealing with the catalyst in the exhaust, that's probably another weak spot area where there's a bit of a restriction that you would want to get around. So we're going to discuss some of the options that you have for dealing with the catalyst in your RB25 engine and just getting the most from your setup. So getting more boost from the standard turbo, there is actually a very simple hack that people are doing on the RB25 engine. So the standard boost on these engines is 2 stages. So initially you've got 0.5 bars of boost, and then you get the NVCS cutting in, which is about 4,500 RPMs, where you hit the stage 2 of your boost level, and boost is then raised to 0.7 bar. So they do this to keep the car drivable in slow moving traffic. Too much boost can actually cause the car to lurch a little bit and make it much harder to control in that stop-start traffic. So that's why Nissan have got that 2 boost set up, just to make sure that the turbo isn't over boosting early on, and it also prolongs the life of the turbo, so the turbo is not working as hard for those little round town trips that you might be doing. But to defeat that system and to stay in the level 2 of boost that it provides all of the time is just a matter of cutting a black wire on the solenoid just to prevent that circuit from opening. You cut the wire, you connect it to ground on the car body somewhere, and hey presto, you're in stage 2 boost, 0.7 bars all of the time. So you will notice that as a fairly significant power power bump, and it literally is a 5 or 10 minute job. There's stuff online in forums and various discussion boards where you can get a little bit more information on that very simple mod that you can do to your RB25 engine. Let me know if you've done that. Let me know your thoughts on it. Were there any drawbacks that you found from doing that mod? So a boost controller gives you a much better control over the boost that the turbo provides. So in most cases, you can take it to about 0.85 bars of boost, which will certainly give you a significant power hike over and above the standard. And it's not just maxing out the boost at 0.85 bars, it will respond more quickly to your throttle inputs. A decent boost controller does a lot more than just fully open the turbo. So it's going to be more subtle in operation, you're going to get more control, and a lot more control can be provided over the boost that you're getting, so you can set the car up more aptly to your tuning requirements and the way you drive the car. So the turbo is providing the boost to the engine, it's compressing the air that's coming in. The quantity of boost is controlled to some degree by the actuator on the turbo. And just to prevent the turbo from spooling indefinitely and over boosting, the wastegate is controlled, and the actuator will signal that wastegate to open and basically cut the flow of exhaust gases from the turbo in the first place, so it's not boosting as much. So in order to get higher boost, the stock boost solenoid is fooling the wastegate into opening later, but that can be detrimental to the life of the turbocharger. It's working much harder. The turbo is spinning at thousands of RPMs. It needs a lot of lubrication. It's generating a lot of heat. And if it's in that zone all of the time, it is going to deteriorate over time relatively quickly. So the aftermarket boost controller allows a lot more control over the boost, the wastegate control, and the way the turbo is spooling up. So it enables you to have a slightly narrower zone of cool down, but still have that cool down zone. And when you're driving on throttle and you want the power, it certainly responds very quickly and makes very fast adjustments to the wastegate and the actuator on the turbo just to maximize the amount of boost that you're getting at any given time. So it's really helpful to have a boost gauge on the dashboard so you can actually see what's going on in the engine. So if you start to get flat spots or problems with boost, just looking at your boost gauge can provide an indication as to what's going on in the engine, and it may flag up a problem area or something that's happening in the engine that's unexpected when it's under certain load conditions. So the heads fitted to the RB25 were pretty much the same on the R33 models. The naturally aspirated one was slightly different in that it obviously didn't have the water lines that go to the turbocharger and the oil line as well. So remapping the ECU is doing a lot of work. It's calculating the amount of fuel to dump, the timing of the spark, whether that's advanced or retarded. It's controlling the boost from the turbo as well via the boost controller. So the ECU can do an awful lot in a modern engine. So getting an aftermarket one will give you a lot more control, and it'll be able to respond much more quickly to things that are happening within the engine. We'd certainly recommend that you get one with some kind of knock protection. On tune projects, the last thing you want is detonation or knock in your engine. It's quite easy to get detonation or knock on your RB25 project if it's not set up correctly. So just having that protection within the ECU that you choose can make quite a big difference. So some of the models of ECU that people have used, aftermarket ECUs that is, on the RB25 engine, are the popular Apexi, the Civex or Civex, however you want to pronounce it, depending on what region you're from. The Haltech Elite 1000, 1500, both really good aftermarket ECUs with lots of settings, great support from Haltech as well. Megasquirt is a popular option as well, so investigate the Megasquirt options and the Megasquirt catalogue to see if that's suitable for your project and the power levels that you're anticipating to get from your RB25 engine. Then you've got the Link G4X and the Impul High Power. So the Link G4 Plus, or a G4 with an external knock control unit, is a really good option. We certainly have to flag that up as one of the options you should consider in your project. We've seen it used and it's worked very effectively. It certainly is a recommended piece of kit. The Civex ECU upgrade is probably the cream of the crop, but it's quite expensive, so you've got to weigh up whether it is worth the extra cost. It certainly is worth the extra cost if you're after those higher power figures and you want a much more flexible ECU that can handle the power you're throwing at it. It's also got a data logging facility which can be quite handy for diagnostics of problems and also fine-tuning your engine and your setup just to make sure you get the maximum power from it. So just changing the ECU on a stock RB25 engine can see power gains of about 30%, which is a significant bump in power. And it's not just a peak power hike, you get a bump all through the RPM range, so you get decent torque both low down, mid-range and at the top end. So air intake mods on the RB25. So when you get a standard engine and you put it on a dyno after you've fitted an induction kit, you will rarely see a significant power increase. There may well be a top end power increase of about 4 or 5%, but to be quite honest, you won't really notice that in everyday driving. And what often happens is at the low end of the power range, there's a dip in power. The aftermarket ECU may be able to flow more air, but it's flowing more slowly, generally because the bore size is greater. So that can have a detrimental effect to the low end torque of your engine. But if you've tuned your RB25 and you're getting significant power gains, you may well be hitting a restriction with the standard factory setup. So going for an aftermarket intake will certainly make a lot of sense on those projects. It'll help you to get around that restriction that you've got in your system. So one that we have seen and has been quite impressive to us is the Apexi dual funnel power intake. It's certainly well designed, it helps your RB25 breathe more easily, and it's ideal for those slightly higher powered projects where you're looking to remove the restriction in the stock factory intake setup. So intercooler upgrades. Now the intercooler is basically a radiator that cools the air charge. Because the turbo is compressing the air that is coming into the engine would be much hotter. The act of compressing adds a lot of heat to the air. So the intercooler basically exposes that air charge to the ambient temperature, and that reduces the temperature. But what happens in tuned projects where you've been driving quite hard is the intercooler itself starts to get warm, and as that happens it becomes less effective at reducing the intake charge. So if your intercooler is warm, you can end up being significantly down on power. So getting a larger, better flowing intercooler with better ducting to the outside can certainly make a difference if you're hitting heat soak. But don't expect to see a power hike just by adding an intercooler or thinking that the intercooler will just look cool on the front of the engine bay. You need to balance your engine's needs and the way you drive it. Are you always on high RPMs and you always hitting heat soak, or is the stock intercooler sufficient for your daily needs and the way you're driving the car? So an intercooler itself may actually free up about 10% of power just by removing the restriction in the airflow that's going into the engine and also resisting heat soak. As a general rule of thumb, they say about 3 litres of intercooler capacity per 100 horsepower that you're running. It's crude, but it seems to be quite effective in the ballpark for about 150 to 400, 425 horsepower. So think about weight as well, because a larger intercooler is generally going to be heavier than a factory standard one, depending on its construction and its design. But in most cases, you're increasing the surface area. So even if different grades of metal have been used in the construction, you're adding weight to your project. So you've got to weigh up whether that extra weight you're adding is going to be offset by the performance gain you're going to see through fitting that intercooler. We've spoken mostly about getting more air into the engine through the turbo, the ECU, boost controller and that sort of thing. The air needs to be matched to fuel. So you've got to make sure you've got enough fueling on your RB25 engine. If that starts to run lean, you'll start to be down on power, you'll hit flat spots and it will cause problems within the engine. So beefing up those fuel injectors and the fuel pump are certainly significant things to consider on those higher power projects. The R33 GTR pump is an obvious upgrade path if you've not got the R33 GTR model, that is. But it's relatively easy to get them nowadays. There's breakers yards offering that part, and it certainly flows much better than the stock one that you'll have in your Skyline. That fuel pump is actually good for about 500 horsepower from what we've heard. Let us know your experiences of fuel pumps and what you feel you need for different power levels. We certainly want to build out a much more rounded picture of RB25 tuning. The standard fuel injectors will generally top out around about 350 horsepower. So if you're thinking of increasing the power significantly, it's not just a matter of upgrading the fuel pump, you'll also need to upgrade the injectors as well. You always want to leave about 20% headroom in your tuning project, just to make sure you've got a little bit of leeway there to get that little bit of extra power should you want to add future mods. And as the whole system degrades, it'll become less efficient. So that 20% will actually be taken up with the inefficiencies as that system starts getting older. So the GTR injectors don't actually fit. It's a bit of a fiddle to get those to work. So you need to get them modified. You need to use the GTR injector ballast as well. which has a different feed and different impedance.
So most people go for 555cc injectors,
similar to what you would use on a Subaru Impreza project. So with turbo upgrades on the RB25, there are lots of aftermarket options. You really do need to look at the spool up characteristics and where they supply the power. The R34 GTT turbo is slightly larger, and that's an obvious upgrade path. It's within the Nissan parts bin. It's relatively easy to source and fit to your RB25 engine. The preference for most tuners is the 3037 Garrett turbo unit or the HS2835, which is good for round about 400 horsepower. Going over 400 horsepower starts to get a little bit pointless on a road car, but obviously on the track you want every drop of performance you can get. The air sensor needs to be able to cope as well with the amount of boost that's being provided. We see 4-bar air sensors coping quite nicely with these higher levels of boost that some of these larger turbos can provide. There's also a range of twin scroll turbos that are coming out now that weren't really available when the RB25 was first launched, and they can improve the scavenging effect of the engine. And I've not actually heard of anyone who's managed to fit a twin scroll turbo to their RB25. So if you have, let me know. Let me know the models and specs that you've got and what power figures you're getting and what the overall effect was on the spool up and how the boost profile suits your driving style. So the factory exhaust on the RB25 is generally okay. It flows pretty well. You'll typically start to see a restriction in the catalyst area. So the catalyst is the pollution control valve that takes the gases from the exhaust, causes it to react out all of the harmful components. So the exhaust gases are much better for the environment. So performance cats perform somewhat differently to the standard catalyst in the engine. So just looking over the exhaust on the RB25, getting a 75mm downpipe can improve the power by about 25 horsepower, give you about 35 pounds-foot of extra torque. Removing the cat will only give you about 10 horsepower, but fitting a sports cat will again gain you about 10 horsepower. So keeping your car legal obviously makes sense. Just getting a better flowing sports catalyst, if it's legal to do so in your area, can make a significant difference, not only on the power figure, the headline power figure that you get, but it also helps the turbo to spool up a little more quickly. So I hope this video has been useful to you. It's given you an overview of the RB25 engine and how to get more power out of it. We've discussed the main mods. There's obviously more detail that we're going to go into in future videos on each of the mods for your RB25. I'd really love your feedback, so let me know in the comments what you've done, what you feel works well. We'd love you to stay tuned, so please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Boot that like button because it helps us to get out there, and thanks for watching.